Hi there, and a very warm welcome to this week's video. Thank you very much for tuning back in. So this week marks the last part of our Blender for Cinema 4D users series, in which we are going to take a look at rendering. So comparing Cinema 4D and Octane with Blender cycles, but also Blender Octane. This of course doesn't mean we have reached our last Blender video. So last week's video is a good example for what I'm going to try to do in the future. So mixing Blender Octane and Cinema 4D Octane in one video and getting new concepts and then showing you how to do it in both software packages. So at least this is what I'm trying to do. If you like that or don't like that, let me know in the comments down below. Now without further ado, let's grab your coffee and let's dive right in. To start out this video, I want to reintroduce a section where I go over useful comments. So this ties in with my first video where I complained I couldn't zoom past a certain threshold and I would have to make another object active and zoom into it with the dot on the numpad. So now I can zoom past the other object, but this is very tedious to do every time you want to zoom, and actually there's a way better way that levitates this on par with Cinema 4D's navigation. So the easy way to do this is to go to your preferences, then navigate to your navigation, and there just hit the depth here. And this basically just uses the object underneath your mouse to zoom in and out to your position, which is the same as Cinema 4D is doing it. So no more activating or deactivating objects. Very nice. There's a little bit on our agenda today, so what we're going to do is render those keycaps, but first we need to update our scene to make them look like this. I'm only going to show this in Blender Octane, but we also have a Cinema 4D scene and also a Blender Cycles scene that is looking very similar. As this is not a shading but a rendering tutorial, I'll be explaining file passes and output passes along the way as we are going. If you want to have a look at the cycle scene as well as the Cinema 4D scene and compare materials and see what I've done here, then you can download them from my Patreon, because I upload every one of those scene files I make in my tutorials there. Alright, so this was the state we left our keycap in the last tutorial. And if you don't know, we did the modeling and the shading in the previous two parts. So if you're interested, upper right corner. So let's go out of shading mode here and then duplicate this keycap. We have a special command here. This is instead of Shift D, Alt D, and then go X and 20. So we move that on the X axis to 20 units. You might be asking, what's so special about Alt D? And this is that we don't duplicate our mesh here, so this one here is the same. So it acts basically as in Cinema 4D a instance would act, not a render instance, mind you. So if I would go into edit mode and then edit something here, let's just grab a point and move it up, you can see it is mirrored on the other object as well. Let's actually make some more use of Blender's key bindings. So let's hit R for rotate, X for the X axis, and then 180. Then what we want to do is grab it on the Z axis and move it up 8.75 units. And then last but not least, rotate again, and this time the Y axis, and then -6 units. And if you go to the side view, you can see now it is laying flat on the floor. Speaking of floor, let's make a floor real quick by going to Shift A and then also go to plane and make this maybe 500 or something like that. So rather big, so we don't see the end of it. If you look closely, what we are missing is a camera and a light. So we also did the word lighting in the tutorial before when we did the shading. So we don't need to set up this anymore. So let's hit Shift A and add a camera, Shift A, add a light, and Shift A, add 2 empties. So this is our null objects if you're coming from Cinema 4D. What I want to do here is make them a little bit smaller. What I want to do also is duplicate one of those and then rename all of those. And then, since actually everything of what we entered into the scene is at the 0 origin, what we can do is hold down Shift on the camera, for example, and move it into the camera null, and the light, and move it into the light null. Since we are a little bit on a time budget, let's go with the values I already know. So let's hit N for the N panel, and for the light, I'm going to the 5, 0, and then 10. And for the angles, I go 65, 0, and then 220. And for the camera, I'm going with a little bit more exotic values, 12, 2, and then 45, and minus 30. Then what we're going to do is move the camera out 90 units and make those angles 0, and move the light out 150 units. So if we go out, we can see this is our light and this is our camera. So let's look through the camera and we can see, well, this is not a good view. And this is because we need to go inside of the camera here and change our start clipping to, for example, 1. And the end clipping, let's take a 0 away there. Last but not least, let's go into the viewport and hit home to center our view here. And this is what we've seen in the rendering before. Next, let's have a look at our scene. So we can see that our light is rather huge. So let's make it smaller. 25 seems to be a good value here. So we have a smaller area light. Let's hit render and see. I already know that the area light is much too bright. So I go with surface brightness here. And also I want to make the appearance orange, so 0.075, 0.8 and 1. Here we go, so we have our nice orange light. Also what I want to do is make this a spotlight. So let's hit Shift A, spot. And there is a spotlight distribution that goes into the distribution here. And you can see something wrong is happening here. And this is because the axes are changed in Blender. So we need to go 0 on the y-axis and 1 on the z-axis to make this work. Let's change a couple of more values here. So I want to make the cone angle 10 and actually the hardness 1, so it's very hard. And then the power is a little bit too low, so we have to set it to whopping 1500. Here we go, this is our light set. Now, before we finally can talk about multipasses and so on, so rendering, let's actually give our floor a material by going to the floor, material settings, new, call it floor. And then actually go to the albedo or diffuse and set it very low, 0.125. And also what we want to do is get the BSDF or BRDF model to GGX and a roughness of 0.25. And if it's not updating, we have to give Octane a little nudge. Let's go back into the camera and last but not least, set the focus of the camera. If we scroll down a bit, you can see depth of field. Actually, I don't want the autofocus. Let's go with 82 for the focus plane. And then instead of 0.89, we want to have a 0.1 here. And now we are all set. Of course, this material is a little bit different, but the SSS material I've used before renders so long that I want to have it as a bonus in the last part of this video. For now, we are just going with this material here. Welcome to Cinema 4D, so basically our ground truth. So what I want to do today is go over a little bit of the render settings as well as splitting out passes, in this case light passes, so we want to split our environment and our spotlight and give that out in separate EXR files. So we are going to do that in Cinema 4D and Octane, but also in Blender and Cycles and Blender Octane. Obviously, the topic of rendering is huge, and therefore I cannot cover everything in detail. If you, however, have an idea what I should cover in detail in the future, let me know in the comments down below, and maybe I make a tutorial about this. If you've watched my older tutorials on Octane, you probably know what's going on here, so you can jump ahead to the future if you'd like. Otherwise, welcome to setting up light passes here in Octane Cinema 4D. So let's set up the light passes first by going to the render settings and enabling Octane as a render engine, and then go to Octane and then render AOV group, which are the passes. So let's enable that and go render AOV manager and search for light, and therefore we can find the light here and double click it 2 times, so 4 clicks. And one, we want to have the ambient light. And second, we want to have the light ID 1, because this is the light ID all the new lights come in, including our spotlight. If you want to separate more lights, of course, you can do up to 20 here. So this is not a problem. You just have to find the light ID. So if we go to the light and the Octane tag here, you can see this is the light ID down here. And then if we up that to, for example, 20, then the ID 20 will be populated. What I really like inside of Cinema 4D is that it gives me the possibility to view my light channels right in the viewport here, so in the live viewer, which makes it really easy to see what's going on. With Octane in Cinema 4D, what you can do is save out the light passes two different ways. One way would be through Cinema 4D here, and another way would be through Octane here. I usually go the Octane route, as this gives me the native output for Octane EXRs and therefore all the benefits, for example, different alphas per channel. This will be very similar inside of Blender later on. Another really cool thing in Cinema 4D is that with output paths you can use token and basically use scene data or project data to name your files. And this is also supported by Octane in Cinema 4D. So for example, right now I am creating a file in the same folder that the Cinema 4D is using with the project name on it and then the extension afterwards. So my usual folder structure is looking like this for projects. So I have all my 3 files here and I want my image files, so the files that are rendered inside of renders. So how to do this is very easy. We go .. and this goes one folder back. Then I want to name the renders folder and then again /, and then I want to make a folder like the project is named and then / to make it a folder, and then I want to make the file sequence also like the project is named. So this is all there is to it, and no matter what scene I'm opening, this link is always working within the project file, and this is what makes this so great. Alright, let's bring this home. If you're an avid viewer of my videos, you know I like my EXRs. Actually, I have some videos on EXR handling, link in the upper right corner for one of those. And also I like my 16-bit float. What I don't like is large files, so we are going with DWAB compression. This one is lossy, but I never had any problems with it. What's really important, since you're not saving anything through Cinema 4D, is that we tick Save Beauty to get the beauty pass through here also. I know both of our light passes we save makes up our beauty pass, but I would say better safe than sorry. What I also want to do is tick off multi-layer files, since I always opt for single-layer files. This is a personal preference. What's really important when saving EXRs is to set the color space to at least linear sRGB, or if you want to go with an ACES workflow, to ACES CG. Obviously, there are other settings such as resolution and frame rate, but I guess you already know about them, so let's talk about sampling here. The really cool thing is that both Cycles and Octane are path tracers and therefore share a lot of settings between them. For example, the main quality setting is the samples, which determines how grain-free or grainy your renders are. There are of course other quality settings as ray depth or caustic blur or GI clamp, which are present in both of the render engines. But since we are a little bit on a time constraint, I want to concentrate on the samples mainly. So what I want to do is get a render region going and span it over the most noisy part of the render and then trying to determine how many samples we need. And this seems to be between 3,000 and 5,000, which is quite a lot, but we have to blame our spotlight for this. So what I'm going to do is get in here 3000, so I'm a bit of a purist, so I go by 1024 times 3. Here we go, 3072. You don't have to do this. This is a purist thing here. Lastly, you can see some white speckles here. Those are hot pixels or fireflies and mainly come from reflections or refractions. Those are basically caustics. I also have a video on this, but for now what we can do is just lower the GI clamp and therefore clamp those secondary rays to a lower value. So let's go with 10 here, and if we render for a bit you can see, yes, they're gone now. Finally, before we hit render, if you're engaged in an ACES workflow, you want to see what your ACES is looking like in your comp process, then you go to Imager and set ACES tone mapping to on, so you can see the ACES to sRGB tone mapping in your live viewer. I of course also have a video on that, link in the upper right corner. So let's finally hit render and render this thing and then have a look in our folder. So in our folder, what we can see is we have all the paths with their respective names. So basically the folder is called like the scene is called, and then the files are also called like the scene is called, with the addition of the render path name. So now that you know how I do it in Cinema 4D, let's finally jump over to Cycles and see what's going on there. Welcome to Blender Cycles land. So before we start, let's actually make ourselves a live viewer. I know that we can render just here, but I'm so used to it, I want one. So let's bring one in here, hit home over both of those screens to get a rough estimate over the aspect ratio. Something like that is okay. And then we can turn off the symbols and render. Here we go. First, as we did in Octane, let's assign our light passes. This is a little bit different here. So in Cycles, we need to go to Shading in the Object Properties, then Light Group, and then name it something, for example, Spot. Here we go. And then in the World, we need to do the same. So World, this is into Settings, then Light Groups, and then let's call it World. Here we go. Now our lights know about the light groups, but Blender doesn't. So let's go to our view layers. Basically, this is the section where you put in all your multipasses. Scroll down here until you see the light groups. You could hit the plus button and then type in the same words manually, but there's an easier way to just add used light groups, and this will figure out what words you typed in what light. As cool and easy to set up this process is, it definitely comes with its caveats. So I was rather shocked to know that there's no way you can view your light layers or light groups within the live viewer. So when I go here, I can, for example, look at the diffuse color, but there is no light layers in here. The only way I found is to final render my frames, which is a big drawback. If you know any methods to do this, please let me know down in the comments. Let's just follow the Cinema 4D recipe and let's talk about sampling. The first thing you notice is this is split into viewport and final render sampling, and you might have noticed that our viewport is rather crude. But even if we type in higher sample counts, nothing is happening, and this is not because the viewport is frozen or something. Actually, the culprit for that is the noise threshold. So the lower that is, the less noise you have in your image until you reach your final samples. This just told the graphics card to stop rendering at a very low level. So if we take it and put it to the same level as our render threshold, you can see that now we have much nicer results. Cycles also has a render region tool, so if you have hard to render parts and you want to see if they are still noisy or not, so you can hit Ctrl B, then move the mouse over them, and then you have your render region. To get rid of it, you can hold Ctrl Alt and B, and then you're back to your full frame. If you remember in Cinema 4D, we had some fireflies here. This is not the case in Cycles, and basically this is because the light paths are already clamped for indirect rays. As well, filter glossy is set to 1, so the highest value. This is analog to caustic blur in Octane. Since you don't have to set anything here, let's scroll further down to the color management and talk about this for a second. This is set to standard, which is basic sRGB. The default settings here would be HEX, which comes in Blender 4.0. HEX is really good, and it also lets you choose your contrast level, so you can really fine-tune it. There's also possibilities to get ACES in here with some other color profiles, but we are not going over that today. However, there are options to output ACES, which we are going to look at next in the output section here. Also, a big shocker for me is that Blender does not have render tokens, so you have to name each and every scene file you output your own. Of course, there are add-ons, but in vanilla Blender, this is just not possible. At least it supports path guiding, or that's what I'm calling it. So for example, 2 forward slashes makes the file start at the Blender file, so wherever your Blender file is in your computer. Then what we can do is ... backslash, and this is the same as in Cinema 4D, so it goes one hierarchy down. So I can use my folder structure and actually call this renders. Here we go. And then another backslash to actually make it a folder, and then call the file, for example, Keycaps. What it also supports is padding. So what we can do is go with a 4-digit leading number here, and then the file extension here is set automatically, so we don't have to set it ourselves. Let's actually get an EXR dialed in here, so let's see if we can find it. Here it is. So we have both the multi-layer EXR and the OpenEXR, which is single layer, and there is a caveat here too. So if you're like me and want to have single layers, this is just not possible over those outputs. You have to go with multi-layer, or you have to go through the compositing context of Blender. So let's go with OpenEXR here, and again set our beloved settings. So half float is good, and then DWAB is also good. And what we want to do is go to color management and then override it. So what we can do here is linear rec 79, which is linear sRGB, so those are equal. Or we can go with a ACCG actually. So the output in ACCG here is definitely possible. I know this is a lot already, but let's actually go over the compositing context to finally get our single layer files. So what we need to do here is go to compositing, but we don't see anything yet. So if we hit nodes, we can see we have our combined world and combined spot output. But if we want to see them, we need to render them. So if we hit F12, we are rendering them in the background. So you can see that here. And since we are not rendering an animation, so this is something also to Blender that's really weird. So if we just render, it isn't saved. We need to render an animation to save out files. So now we have in the compositing context, at least it should be popping up here. So what we can do is try out and hit Shift A and then hit a viewer node here. And yes, now you can see it. So we have our light passes visible for the first time actually. And this is also where we save them from. So Shift A again and then output, here file output. And then what we can do is pipe in some file in there and then hit N for the panel here since we need that. And then go to Node, Properties. And here you can see we have properties with our EXR here. And then we can add in more inputs. So for example, let's add an input and rename it like world, and an input, then rename it spot. Here we go, and those show up here. So what we can do is wire those respective outputs in here. And then last but not least, what I want to do is go to the follow scene in color management and also override it and go with my ACCG here too. As I said before, only animations are saved. So what we need to do actually is go to our tab here and set the animation to start and end at the same frame. So what we can do now is hit Ctrl and F12, and this then will render the animation. You can see it down here starting. If we watch our folder now, what you can see, the original EXR is saved with our beauty file. But here you can see we have some problems with the padding. Also in here, this is saved correctly, but we don't have the underscore here. This numbering is done automatically. So what I would suggest here inside of Blender is go into the file again and then remove the padding here as well as the underscore and then put underscores after each word. So we have underscore and then the number. And as you can imagine, this is not the best pipeline thing ever. As the next chapter is Octane, I promise I keep this short as we did go over much of it in Cinema 4D already. Welcome to Blender Octane land. Let's do it as in the other segments and set up our light passes first. So if I go to my light, you can see the light pass ID is just inside of the nodes here. As with Octane Cinema 4D, the environment doesn't have to be set up. So what we need to do is go to our passes, to lighting, and then set in the ambient and light pass 1. And this is it. I'm still missing a gizmo in the live viewer, but at least you can watch your passes here. So this is a whole plethora of things and it's a little bit daunting to look at, but you can see the ambient light and as well as the light pass 1. So at least you can see it in the live viewer here. Let's get this back to combined and actually do a render region. So I noticed when 2 displays are active, this is not working in Octane. So Control B, same as cycles. But you can see I need to stop and start rendering again in order to make Octane notice that. So Control Alt B is working, so we are back to normal here. When it comes to sampling, this is very similar to Cinema 4D with the one difference that we have preview samples here as well. To make it a little bit confusing, the preview samples are the second entry here, while in cycles it's the first entry. But oh well, you gotta live with that. Actually, if you first time using the path tracing kernel, the GI clamp will be set to 1 million, so you have to set it down yourself. So I have just the preset here, which I made when I installed Octane, so I don't have to set it every time. You can find a more detailed description of how to set up Octane for Blender in the video before, as we needed to do that in order to make the shading work. Let's have a look at our output next, and oh joy, it's not as complicated as Blender cycles. This comes mainly from the fact that Octane has its own output settings here. It will reuse whatever path you use up here, but then you have the options of prefixes and postfixes, and if you hover your mouse over there, you have some really nice tooltips. Octane has some sort of render tokens as well, so $Octane pass $ will then give in your Octane pass in there. So what I usually do and what I noticed is you can put that token also in the prefix. This means that your number won't be obscured by any name afterwards. Okay, let's go over some of the options here. A really cool thing here is that if you have ACES tone mapping enabled, so let's go here, and this is how you set it up. So ACES tone mapping here, and then N to roll that in again. And you can see that we can get the baked in tone mapping through the Blender output, while we can get the ACES EXRs through the Octane output, which is really handy. So let's set this up here. Let's go with EXR. 16-bit is okay, and then go with ACES here. Let's scroll a bit down to see the further options. Of course, our trusted DWAB compression. And then what we also can do is, for example, exclude the beauty here if we just solely want to use it on our Blender output, which we don't, so I don't tick that on. Last but not least, you can also use a different path if you untick that. And we want to enable it altogether. So yes, let's go with the Octane output for sure. To finish up, let's view what's going on in the folders if we render. I made 2 small mistakes. So one is an underscore here and also a underscore here. Here we go. So let's hit Ctrl F12 to render the final image. Let's go to rendering to see what's going on. And yes, we are here and rendering. And in our folder, we can see we have a PNG, which actually has the ACES tone mapping baked in, as well as 3 EXRs with every pass that have full ACES CG color range. Now at the end, as a small bonus, let's actually make the SSS shader I talked about in the beginning. Alrighty, back to shading. Who would have thought? Actually, we did because I mentioned it way in the beginning. Actually, this is not that hard and also shouldn't take that long. So first of all, let's make light enter the object by going to the transmission and actually set it to diffuse. I know this was set to diffuse, but if you make a universal material from scratch, it's set to specular. Now let's make a transmission medium and actually go with a grayscale color here. So this makes light go inside the material, and let's make this actually 1, so a lot of light gets into the material. What is going right now in the albedo we want to use in our random walk medium, so let's unblock the albedo here and make it completely black. So there's all the light entering the object now. This object acts like there's thin walls of paper next to each other, but we want to actually bring them together by adding a SSS, so some medium inside between the walls. So let's actually go to medium here and add a random walk medium, since this is the best to control some properties with it. So random walk here. And also what we want to do here is get to the albedo of the random walk and feed it with the albedo that we had in our universal materials albedo before. Not a lot has changed, and this is because the object is very thin-walled, so we need to get the density a lot higher, so 2000 was a good value. Now this is very dark and dirty looking, and this is because our values for the albedo are very dark now. So let's go and actually make them a little bit brighter by going with 0.7 here, and actually 0.7 for all of them. And the last one here, this is the dirty bit that gets a value of 0.5. Now with a lot of object, when light penetrates through, they get a little bit of a reddish tint, and you can actually do this by going to the radius here and set it to be 0.03, so slightly red, and then I don't know the value anymore, so 0.25 or something like that. So a slight orange color. And you can see this helps a lot to make it even more realistic. And this is basically it. We instantly tripled your render times, but it also looks better if you're honest. And this is also it for this week's video. Thank you very much for watching. Next week I'm on vacation, so no video unfortunately. After that, again, it's the same time, same channel. Now let me thank those people who make those videos possible, my Patreons. Especially my €50 tier subscribers, Shields Augustinen and Leon Studio TV. I can only repeat myself and really thank you for your massive support. Also, my €15 tier subscribers, Render King Alessandro Bonchio, Alessio De Vecchi, Bavana, BVR, Chris Fritchie, Christian Grajewski, Computer Generated, Erbe Plus Academy, George Luna, Harish Pavaskar, Choi Chikolin, Just a Frickin', Chris Clemson, Ludger, Nico Straub, Part 1 of 2, Guok Andang, Raiko, Renato Marquez, Reshock, Shamus Johnson, Shiro 2049, Terry Wayne Ranson, Yasin Rupp, and Shibo Shang. Welcome to our therapy session for too long videos. If you're actually hearing that, thank you so very much for staying with me. I can't believe it, you made it through the long video and kept up watching. I actually don't know why my videos always turn out so long. Basically, I condense a lot of things already in there and they still keep getting longer. I think I need to start make short videos again. Anyway, if you want to show your support with all the rendering that's going on, please leave a clapper emoticon in the comments down below. I wish you the best start into the week, an amazing time, and happy rendering. Bye.